Welcome back to Cowboy Ironheart, my friends. Pull up a chair by the hearth and let the warmth settle into your bones, because the story Moat have for you tonight is one that will remind you how a single soul can stand against the fiercest storm when there is something precious left to protect. The wind did not duete blow through the high plains. That autumn evening, it shrieked like a dying creature, carrying a choking wall of blinding white dust that erased the horizon in a matter of seconds. Inside the shaking timber walls of the old livery, Evelyn pressed her fragile, slender back against the splintered wood, her small hands clawed tight over her chest as the air turned into a suffocating fog of grit and ash. She could barely draw a breath, her lungs burning, her delicate vision darkening as the sheer weight of the frontier threatened to bury her alive right there on the dirt floor. Then, out of the blinding gloom, a massive shadow loomed over her, shutting out the roaring chaos of the world. It was Gideon, the silent giant who had watched her from a distance for weeks, and before another terrified sob could tear from her throat, he unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster and pulled her entirely into his massive, unyielding chest. He wrapped the thick, weather-beaten coat tightly around both of them, locking out the freezing gale and trapping her in the absolute darkness of his shelter. Their faces were mere inches apart in the hidden, warm dark, his deep, rhythmic breathing acting as the only anchor keeping her heart from shattering to pieces while the tempest raged outside. It is a genuine pleasure to have you here at Cowboy Ironheart, where we strip away the noise of the modern world to find the quiet, beating heart of the frontier. If you are finding a little bit of yourself in this story, if you are feeling that gentle pull toward hope and the comfort of being understood, then take a moment to subscribe. We have many more miles to travel together, and Mott would be honored to have you with us on this journey of healing and resilience. Now, let us step back into that stifling afternoon in Bitter Creek. You see, the heat in the Montana Territory doesn't just sit on you. It presses down like a physical weight, thick with the scent of dry sage, sun-baked timber, and the endless, aching expanse of the prairie. For Evelyn, every day had become a battle of survival, not against the wild, but against the crushing indifference of people who had forgotten what it meant to be soft in a hard land. She walked the boardwalk with her head held low, the rough wood creaking under her thin-soled boots. Her dress, once a vibrant navy blue back in the home she had been forced to abandon, was now faded by the relentless sun and marked with the dust of 100 failed attempts to find work. She felt the eyes of the townspeople on her, not with kindness, but with that cold, measuring judgment reserved for those who had nothing left to give. The town of Bitter Creek was a place of sharp angles and harder hearts, clustered against the foothills like a scab that wouldn't heal. It was a place where reputation was currency, and Evelyn had none. She was a phantom in their midst, a reminder of tragedies they wanted to keep buried. And then there was Silas. He was a man of the land. He was a man of ledgers and locks, a merchant who measured the worth of a human soul by the coins in their pocket. He stood on the porch of his store, his thumbs hooked into his vest, a cigarette dangling from his lip like a cynical smile. As Evelyn passed, he just ignore her. He made a performance of it. He spat on the ground near her feet, his voice cutting through the sluggish afternoon air with the sharpness of a whip. He remarked to the men loitering nearby that it was a shame the wolves hadn't taken care of the strays before they reached town, his laughter jagged and mocking. Evelyn stopped, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't look at him. She couldn't bear to see the triumph in his eyes, but she felt the heat of his derision, the way it made the air around her feel toxic. She had arrived as a bride, full of dreams, only to find the man she was promised to laid in the ground, leaving her with a patch of unyielding, rocky earth and a homestead that had been stripped bare by creditors and the unforgiving climate. She was a delicate thing, yes, but her fragility was the only part of her the town could see. They didn't see the woman who had buried her husband with her own hands. They didn't see the woman who had walked for miles through snow and rain to keep the promise she had made to a ghost. They only saw a target. Her fingers brushed the small silver locket at her throat, the last remnant of her life before the fire, before the hunger, before the silence. It was a grounding weight, a reminder that she existed, that she was made of more than just dust and rejection. But standing there, under the relentless, uncaring sky, the crushing weight of her isolation felt almost too much to bear. She thought of turning back, of walking out into the prairie until the horizon swallowed her whole, but she knew there was no safety there either. The air grew suddenly, unnervingly still. It was the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. The birds, usually a constant soundtrack of chatter in the brush, fell completely silent. The wind, which had been a hot, dry breeze, died away entirely, leaving the valley in a suffocating vacuum. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Evelyn looked up at the mountains, their jagged peaks rising like the teeth of a sleeping giant against the bruised, darkening sky. That was when the heavy, iron-bound door of the livery stable, situated at the far end of the street, creaked open on its massive hinges. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the soles of her feet. Out of the gloom of that cavernous structure stepped a man who seemed to embody the very mountains he lived among. Gideon. He didn't just walk. He moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. His stature was so immense that he seemed to blot out the light behind him, a towering monolith of corded muscle and raw, untamed strength. His canvas duster, dark and worn from years of exposure to the elements, hung heavy from his broad, powerful shoulders. His hat, pulled low, cast a deep shadow over eyes that were the color of stone and twice as hard. Gideon didn't hurry. He didn't need to. The townspeople, who had been laughing at Evelyn only a heartbeat before, fell into a sudden, rigid silence. The men standing near Silas shifted their weight, their bravado evaporating like morning mist. Silas himself, the man who had been so loud, so cruel, so confident in his status, went pale. He didn't speak. He couldn't tea. Gideon walked down the center of the dusty road, his gaze fixed straight ahead, yet Evelyn could feel the weight of his attention shift toward her. It was a protective, anchoring presence, as palpable as a physical shield. He passed within inches of her, and for a fleeting second, the air around him felt cooler, cleaner, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and the damp earth of hot mountain caves. He stopped a few paces past her, planting his feet firmly in the dirt, and turned to face the storehouse. He didn't square his shoulders in a fight. He didn't need to brandish a weapon. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of silence, his presence an authoritative claim that the ground she stood on was protected. His large, calloused hands rested naturally at his sides, fingers slightly curled, ready for work but currently held in a state of watchful calm. Silas looked at him, his mouth opening as if to spout some retort, but the words died in his throat. The sheer, overwhelming reality of Gideon, his size, his stillness, the quiet intensity in his slate-gray eyes, was a language more powerful than anything the storekeeper could ever utter. It was a silent, devastating rebuke. Silas, with a mumbled excuse to no one in particular, turned and retreated into the darkness of his store, the door clicking shut behind him with a final, defeated sound. Evelyn remained where she was, her breath hitching in her chest. She had never been defended in her life. She had never known what it felt like to have someone stand between her and the world, to be the barrier that stopped the cruelty from reaching her. She looked at Gideon, her sapphire eyes wide, searching for a trace of the judgment she was used to, but finding only a deep, profound stillness. He didn't ask her if she was all right. He didn't pity her. He simply looked at her, his gaze holding hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. And in that look, there was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that they were both outsiders in a world that demanded conformity. Then the sky cracked. A low guttural roar began to roll down from the northern peaks, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the marrow of the bones. The wind, absent only a moment ago, returned with a violent, screaming fury, whipping up the dust and grit of the valley floor into a blinding, suffocating cloud. It wasn't just a storm, it was a wall of earth, moving with the speed and power of a runaway train. The world, which had been sharply defined only seconds before, began to blur and dissolve into a chaotic, swirling vortex of ochre and gray. Gideon reacted with the precision of a creature that knew exactly how to dance with nature's fury. He moved toward her, his stride eating the distance between them, and before she could even process the sudden violence of the wind, his hand, warm, broad, and startlingly firm, gripped her upper arm. It wasn't a grab, it was a claim of safety. He steered her, shielding her with his own massive body as the first wave of the storm slammed into them. It was like running into a solid, impenetrable object. The grit stung her skin, finding its way into her eyes and mouth, and she gasped, her hands instinctively clutching at his coat for balance. He didn't pause, he didn't falter. He propelled her toward the livery, the only structure sturdy enough to withstand the gale. The world had turned into a nightmare of sound and motion, the roar of the wind drowning out all thought, the darkening sky casting them into an early, unnatural night. He kicked open the heavy, reinforced door, pulling her into the sudden, blessed silence of the interior, and pushed the door shut behind them, throwing the heavy iron bolt with a resounding clang that cut off the scream of the storm. They were in the darkness, the only light filtering in through the gaps in the high, dusty rafters. Evelyn was trembling, the adrenaline of the moment leaving her legs weak. She stood in the dim, stale air of the stable, the scent of hay and horse leather wrapping around them. She could hear his breathing, deep, steady, and rhythmic, as if he were the only thing in the world that remained unbothered by the chaos outside. He was standing close to her, his massive frame radiating a heat that she could feel even through the layers of her clothing. She felt small, so incredibly small, against his solid, immovable bulk. She looked up, trying to find his face in the gloom, but he was a silhouette, a shadow carved from the night. His hand was still on her arm, his thumb tracing a slow, grounding pattern against the thin fabric of her sleeve. It was a touch that spoke of a gentle, terrifyingly deep strength. She realized then that she wasn't just safe. She was sheltered. She was in the care of a man who didn't know the meaning of the word fragile as a weakness, but rather as something to be cradled, to be guarded, to be kept away from the sharp edges of the world. The storm raged outside, pounding against the walls, tearing at the shingles, but inside, in the dark held by the silent protector, Evelyn found a stillness she hadn't known since she was a child. The fear, for the first time in years, was replaced by a strange, quiet sense of belonging. The storm outside the livery walls wasn't just a weather event. It was a living, breathing entity, a beast of dust and air that wanted nothing more than to scour the earth clean of anything that couldn't anchor itself deep enough. Inside, however, the world had narrowed down to a single, impossible point of stillness. The darkness was thick, smelling of aged timber, dried hay, the sweet rot of old straw, and the sharp, clean scent of the high mountains that seemed to cling to Gideon's coat like a memory. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind that tore at the shingle roof, a high-pitched, banshee-like wail that made the very foundations of the building groan. Evelyn stood there, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches, her hands still trembling from the transition from the blinding chaos of the prairie to this sudden, suffocating sanctuary. She could feel the vibration of the storm in her bones, a rhythmic drumming that pulsed against the walls. But she wasn't looking at the cracks where the light struggled to break through. She was looking at the shadow before her. Gideon was a mountain in the dark. He was so much larger than her that the perspective felt skewed, as if he were a giant from an old storybook, a creature of earth and iron who had stepped out of the crags to offer shelter. He didn't reach out to touch her immediately, respecting the invisible boundaries that she had spent years building to protect what remained of her spirit. He simply stood there, his presence radiating a heat that cut through the chill that had settled in her marrow. He listened to the storm, his head slightly cocked as if he were reading the wind, gauging its fury, deciding how best to keep this fragile, shivering creature from shattering under the pressure of the elements. Slowly, deliberately, he moved. The sound of his leather boots on the hard-packed dirt was heavy and reassuring, a sound of stability in a world that had tilted sideways. He began to unbutton the heavy, dark canvas duster he wore. It was a garment that had seen 1,000 winters, stiff with age and the salt of long rides, a protective layer that had served as his only true companion for years. As he worked the heavy brass buttons, the sound of the metal clicking in the dark was loud, rhythmic, and strangely intimate. Evelyn watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the shape of his hands, massive, calloused, scarred, as they worked the fabric. He knew exactly what she needed. He didn't ask if she was cold, though she was shaking so violently her teeth were beginning to chatter. He didn't ask if she was afraid, though the terror of the storm was written in the wide, dilated pupils of her eyes. He simply acted. With a movement that was deceptively graceful for a man of his size, he shrugged the heavy coat from his broad shoulders. It was a garment that was twice as wide as her entire frame, a sweeping, heavy cloak of protection. He stepped closer, the air shifting as he moved, and he draped the heavy, grit-covered canvas over her, pulling her close against his chest. It felt like being wrapped in a shelter, a physical barrier against the madness of the world outside. He brought the edges of the duster around her, cocooning her against his torso so that they were pressed together, his warmth seeping into her, his sheer, solid mass acting as a wall between her and the storm. Their faces were inches apart in the dark. He looked down at her, his eyes unreadable in the gloom, yet she could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the judging look of the townsfolk. It was the steady, calm look of a man who understood that his duty was to be the rock upon which the waves broke. He whispered for her to breathe, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through his chest and into hers. He told her that the storm was just noise, that it couldn't touch them in here, that he had built this shelter to withstand the worst the territory had to offer. It was the first time she had heard him speak at length, and the sound was like the rolling of stones deep in a riverbed, deep, resonant, and profoundly grounding. She leaned into him, not because she was weak, but because for the first time in years she didn't have to be strong. She let her forehead rest against the rough, coarse fabric of his flannel shirt, right over his heart, which beat with a slow, steady, and unhurried rhythm. It was a rhythm of life, of endurance, of someone who had survived everything the mountain had thrown at him, and slowly the panic that had gripped her throat began to recede. The howling of the wind seemed to fade into the background, becoming nothing more than the background noise of a world that no longer had any power over her. She confessed to him, her voice barely a whisper in the tight, dark space, that she had forgotten vekephat ate it felt like to be safe. She admitted that she had spent so long bracing for the next blow, for the next loss, that she had forgotten how to stand still. Gideon didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her that everything would be all right, because he knew that in the territory you couldn't promise that. Instead, he simply held her tighter, his massive arms wrapped around her, his chin resting near the top of her head. He told her that safety wasn't about the absence of storms, but about knowing what to do when the wind started to scream. He told her that she was not a burden, that the townspeople were fools for mistaking her resilience for fragility, and that he had seen her working that dry, rocky land, fighting the weeds, trying to build something out of nothing. He told her that he had been watching her for a long time, from the hot ridge, seeing her struggle, seeing her quiet dignity, and that he had been waiting for the right moment to step in. Not because she needed a savior, but because even the strongest survivors needed a place to rest their heads. The weight of his words, combined with the weight of his body and the warmth of his duster, brought tears to her eyes. She felt the salt track down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief. They were the tears of a dam breaking, of the pressure finally releasing. She let herself sob just once, a ragged, broken sound that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the gale outside. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just held her, his hand moving in a slow, circular motion on her back, a gesture so gentle it felt like a benediction. Outside, the storm intensified. The building shook, a timber beam groaning overhead as the wind pushed against it with the force of a battering ram. The sky was an inferno of dirt, a blinding, choking wall that scoured the paint off the wagons and buried the street in a foot of silt. The town of Bitter Creek was being erased, temporarily turned into a ghost town, its petty grievances and cruelties rendered meaningless by the sheer, overwhelming power of the earth. But inside the livery, the world was small, private, and intensely real. Evelyn looked up, trying to catch his eyes in the shadows. She asked him why he chose to live in the silence, why he chose to be the one to stand apart from the noise of the town. Gideon's answer was quiet, thoughtful. He spoke of the mountain, of the way the air tasted cleaner up there, away from the lies and the gossip. He spoke of the animals, of the horses he raised, who were honest in their reactions. If they were scared, they showed it. If they were calm, they were calm. There was no deception in the wild. He told her that people, with their complex schemes and their need to pull others down, were the only things he didn't quite understand. He preferred the predictability of the seasons, the truth of the sunrise, and the heavy, honest burden of labor. She asked him if he ever felt lonely, and the silence that followed stretched out for a long time. It was a silence that wasn't empty, but full of things left unsaid. Finally, he admitted that yes, there were nights when the cold seeped into his cabin, when the fire died down to embers, and the silence of the high country felt a little too deep, a little too vast. He confessed that he had grown used to it, that he had built his life around the absence of others, but that since he had seen her, the silence had begun to feel a little different. It felt like a void waiting to be filled, rather than a wall he had built to keep the world out. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and significant. Evelyn felt her breath catch again, this time for an entirely different reason. She realized that she wasn't the only one who had been hiding. This giant, this man of steel and stone, had been hiding too, not from the cruelty of the town, but from the possibility of being known. And in the dark of that livery, surrounded by the debris of the storm, they were both exposed. The storm didn't show signs of breaking. The wind continued to batter the building, a relentless, punishing rhythm. But the fear had changed. It was no longer the sharp, acidic fear of being destroyed. It was the softer, more terrifying fear of being seen. She felt the curve of his muscles under her palms, the raw power held in check, the immense capacity he had for destruction, currently entirely surrendered to the act of protection. It was a humbling realization. She was a delicate thing, yes, a reed in a hurricane, but he was the bedrock, and for the first time, she felt like she might actually survive the winter. She asked him what he thought would happen when the storm passed, when the sky cleared and the world returned to its normal, grinding routine. Gideon didn't offer a prediction. He said that the storm would leave a mess behind, debris to clear, fences to mend, water sources to check. He said that life would go on exactly as it had before, but that perhaps, after this, they would both be a little different. He said that he wasn't going anywhere, that his land was his anchor, and that if she needed someone to stand between her and the wind, she knew where to find him. It wasn't a promise, not in the traditional sense, but it was more than a promise. It was an invitation to exist within the orbit of his strength, and as the wind shrieked one last violent note before settling into a steady, low-frequency hum, Evelyn closed her eyes. She felt the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his duster, the sheer, immovable presence of his body. She was still a widow. She was still poor. She was still an outsider in a town that didn't want her. But as she drifted in the darkness, she felt a kernel of something she hadn't touched in years' hope. The storm was clearing. She could tell by the way the light began to change, shifting from a deep, bruised purple to a lighter, dusty gray as the clouds started to thin. The world was still out there, the same cruel, judgmental world she had walked into earlier that day. But the transition would not be sudden. They would have to return to the reality of the street, to the judgment of the town, to the harsh demands of the frontier. But for a few more moments, they remained in the dark, in the shelter of the livery, hidden from everything but each other. Gideon's hand moved from her back to her shoulder, his fingers resting there with a deliberate, comforting pressure. He told her to stay still, to gather her strength, because the coming days would be hard, and she would need all the resilience she possessed. He said that the town would talk, that they would look at them, emerging from the storm together, and they would weave their own stories. He told her not to care. He told her that the opinions of men like Silas were like the dust in the storm. They would swirl and coat everything for a time, but eventually the rain would wash them away, and they would be left with nothing but the truth of the ground they stood on. She nodded against his chest, her voice muffled but clear. She said she understood. She said she had stopped caring about the town a long time ago, but that she had never had a reason to stop caring about herself until now. She felt him stiffen slightly at her words, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps recognition, passing through him. He said that he was glad, that she deserved to have a reason to fight, and that he would be there to ensure she never had to fight alone again. The air in the livery was warming up, the chill of the storm being replaced by the heat of their bodies. Evelyn felt a deep, profound sense of fatigue washing over her, not the exhausted, bone-deep tiredness of grief, but the kind of rest that comes after a long, hard climb. She let her head fall back against his arm, and for the first time she truly looked at him. In the dim light she could see the planes of his face, the rugged lines carved by the sun, the quiet, watchful intelligence in his eyes. He was a man who had seen everything the territory could offer, and yet he still had this capacity for gentleness that felt like the rarest thing on earth. She thought about the life she had left behind, the house she had lost, the husband who had loved her, the tragedy that had sent her west. It all felt so distant now, like a story she had read in a book about someone else. The present moment was so vivid, so immediate, so undeniable. The dust storm was the dividing line between her past and whatever future she was now stepping into. And as the wind finally died down, the silence that followed was heavy with anticipation, with the quiet promise of a new day that would bring ve capite hatit new challenges, but also for the first time a new, immovable ally. She realized that the storm hadn't just been a trial. It had been a crucible. It had stripped away the pretensions of the town, the safety of their separate lives, and had forced them together in the dark. It had taken two people who were both isolated, both carrying their own burdens, and had merged them into a single, shared reality. The wind had ceased, the world was still, and as Gideon began to move, preparing to open the door, Evelyn felt a momentary pang of loss at the thought of the barrier between them ending. But then he looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw the same reluctance. He didn't want the moment to end either. He didn't step back immediately. He waited until she was ready, until she had her bearings, his hand still firmly, supportively on her shoulder. He told her that they would walk out together, that he would see her back to her homestead, and that no one would dare say a word. It was a declaration, a vow of protection that he made not to the world, but to her. And as he reached for the latch of the heavy door, throwing it open to the bright, dusty post-storm afternoon, Evelyn didn't feel like the fragile widow who had walked into town earlier that morning. She felt like someone who had survived the tempest, someone who had stood in the eye of the storm and come out the other side, held by the strongest force she had ever known. She stepped out into the light, and for the first time the frontier didn't look like a place where she would die. It looked like a place where she could live. The journey, she realized, had only begun, and it would be a long, arduous road. But for the first time in years, she was walking it by herself. Gideon stood beside her, his massive shadow-blending ve-kepte hat hers on the dusty ground, a silent, powerful, and undeniable testament to the fact that she was no longer alone. The air was clear, the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue, and though the work of rebuilding, of surviving, of forging a life in this harsh and beautiful land lay ahead, she faced it with a steady gaze. She had been sheltered, she had been protected, and now she was ready to face whatever came next, because she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that no matter how hard the wind blew, she would never have to face it unprotected again. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. It was a heavy, ringing kind of quiet, the sort that only happens after the world has been scoured by a force so powerful it makes everything else seem small and inconsequential. As Gideon swung that heavy, timber-framed door open, the light that flooded into the livery was not the sharp, aggressive sun of the morning. It was a soft, diffused gold, filtered through the lingering particles of dust that hung in the air like a veil of diamonds. Evelyn stepped out first, her legs feeling unsteady, her eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. The town of Bitter Creek, which had been a place of sharp edges and biting words only hours before, looked fundamentally different. The dust had settled everywhere, coating the boardwalks, the hitching posts, and the roofs in a thick monochromatic layer of gray. It felt as if the town had been wiped clean, the past temporarily buried under a blanket of earth. Gideon emerged behind her, a dark, immovable silhouette against the pale light. His presence was a physical weight, a gravitational force that seemed to anchor the very space around them. He didn't say a word, he didn't need to, but he stepped out and positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of Evelyn. It was a placement that wasn't accidental. He was shielding her, acting as a buffer between her and the world, even in the stillness. The townspeople who had been huddled in their own shelters were beginning to emerge. Doors were creaking open along the street, and voices, cautious, inquisitive, began to drift through the stagnant air. As they walked down the center of the street, the impact of their arrival was immediate. It was that the townspeople were shocked to see them together, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way Gideon carried himself. He moved with the slow, deliberate stride of a predator that has no need to threaten because its power is already understood. He didn't look at the men leaning against the storefronts. He didn't acknowledge the women whispering behind their hands. And he certainly didn't give a second thought to Silas, who stood in the shadow of his doorway, his face a mask of frustrated, impotent rage. Gideon simply ka-pete his eyes on the path ahead, his gaze focused on the horizon, his entire demeanor broadcasting a clear, non-negotiable message. This woman is under my protection, and woe betide anyone who thinks otherwise. Ellen could feel the eyes of the town on her, but for the first time their judgment didn't cut. It felt distant, like the buzzing of flies on a summer day. Irritating, perhaps, but ultimately powerless. She kept her head high, her small hand brushing the sleeve of Gideon's duster as they walked. The contact was a lifeline, a tangible reminder that she was not alone. The distance to her homestead seemed shorter than it had. That morning, the path familiar yet transformed. The landscape had been reshaped by the wind. Drifts of soil were piled against the fences like miniature dunes. and the sagebrush was flattened and tangled. It was a mess, a testament to the harsh reality of their life here. But as she looked at it, she didn't feel the usual despair. She felt a strange, quiet sense of possibility. As they reached the edge of her property, the scene was one of disarray. Her small, humble cabin, which she had fought so hard to keep from falling into ruin, had taken the brunt of the storm. A shutter hung precariously by one hinge, swinging in the gentle post-storm breeze with a rhythmic, mournful creak. A section of the split-rail fence had been pushed over, and the garden plot, where she had been trying to coax life out of the stubborn, rocky soil, was buried under a foot of silt. It was a discouraging sight, one that would have sent her into a spiral of defeat only a few hours ago. But today it was just work. It was just a problem to be solved. Gideon stopped at the gate, his hand resting on the top rail. He surveyed the damage with that same steady, analytical gaze he applied to everything. He didn't offer empty sympathy, and he didn't apologize for the world's cruelty. He simply started to move, his immense size making the task of clearing the fence look almost effortless. He reached down, gripping the heavy, weathered timber vekepte hot hands that were as calloused and strong as the land itself, and with a grunt of exertion, he levered the rails back into position. He was a man of action, a man who understood that in the frontier, words were often just wind. But labor was how you proved your worth, how you proved your commitment. Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with a mixture of awe and something that felt dangerously like affection. She had spent so long trying to be everything to everyone, the dutiful wife, the mourning widow, the resilient survivor, that she had forgotten what it was to have someone else take the burden off her shoulders. She walked over to the garden, picking up a rake that had been discarded in the dust, and began to work alongside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The work itself was a conversation, a rhythm of effort and accomplishment that bound them together more effectively than any declaration of intent. As the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, the work was mostly done. The fence was upright, the debris cleared from the porch, and the path to the cabin was clear. The air was cooling, the temperature dropping with the swiftness that signaled the coming of night. Gideon paused, wiping the dust from his brow with the back of his hand, and looked at her. He didn't look at her as a fragile creature anymore. He looked at her as a partner, someone who had contributed to the work, someone who had held their own against the chaos. He leaned against the gatepost, his massive form silhouetted against the vibrant, fire-streaked sky. He asked her if she had enough firewood to see her through the night. It was a practical question, but she heard the deeper meaning behind it. He was checking to see if she was prepared, if she was safe, if she had what she needed to survive. She told him that she had enough, that she would be fine. But as she said it, she realized how much she didn't want him to leave. The thought of the quiet returning, of the silence of the cabin wrapping around her, felt suddenly hollow. She had grown accustomed to the presence of his strength, the reassurance of his proximity. Gideon seemed to sense her hesitation. He shifted his weight, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't move to leave. He stood there watching the transition of the light, his silence as heavy and meaningful as a vow. He told her that he had a few things to finish at his own place, that the storm had been rough on his livestock, but that he would be back in the morning to check on the cabin's roof. It was a promise, a simple, straightforward, and entirely reliable promise. Evelyn felt a smile touch her lips, a real, genuine smile, the first one she had felt in a long, long time. She thanked him, her voice steady and clear. She told him that she would be here, that she would be ready for him. The look he gave her in return was a silent acknowledgement, a meeting of minds and spirits that required no further explanation. It was a moment of profound, quiet intimacy, shared in the cooling air of the high plains, with the mountains as their only witness. As he turned to leave, his long, purposeful stride carrying him back toward the foothills, Evelyn stood at the gate and watched him go. He was a mountain of a man, a solitary force of nature, yet for the first time he was not entirely solitary. He was linked to her, their lives woven together by the threads of the storm, by the shared labor, and by the unspoken recognition of their mutual need. She turned and walked toward her cabin, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her, but it was a good, solid weight, the weight of living, of surviving, of finally, truly belonging. The interior of the cabin was warm, the lingering heat of the day trapped within the walls. She moved through the rooms, lighting the lantern, the soft glow casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. She went to the kitchen area, setting a kettle on the stove, the familiar routine grounding her. She thought about the life she had led, the choices she had made, and the strange, unpredictable path that had brought her here, to this exact moment. She had been so afraid for so long of the judgment of others, of the cruelty of the world, of the crushing loneliness of the frontier. But she realized now that those fears had been a cage, one she had built for herself, brick by brick, out of her own insecurity and the pain of her past. Gideon had not just protected her from the storm. He had protected her from her own fear. He had shown her that she could be strong, that she could be resilient, that she could survive even when the world seemed determined to break her. He had shown her that there was another way to live, a way that wasn't defined by the expectations of others, but by the quiet, honest truth of her own heart. She sat at the small table, nursing a cup of tea, the steam rising in the cool air, and allowed herself the luxury of reflection. She realized that she was no longer the same woman who had arrived in Bitter Creek. She had been tempered, like steel in a fire, and the fragile, delicate woman who had been so afraid of the wind was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power. She walked to the window, peering out into the deepening twilight. The landscape was still, the dust settled, the world at peace. But she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tasks, new trials to test their resolve, and she knew that the town would not forget. They would talk, they would speculate, they would wonder about the nature of her relationship with the giant who lived in the high country. But she also knew that it didn't matter. The opinion of the world had lost its sting. She had an ally, a guardian, a partner who stood vakep with te hat her against the gale, and that knowledge was a shield that no amount of gossip could pierce. She thought about his hands, the way he had moved to fix the fence, the gentleness he had shown in the shelter of the livery. He was a man of contrasts, a man whose external power was matched by an internal depth she was only diuete beginning to understand. He was not a man who spoke easily, nor was he a man who offered his trust to just anyone, and yet he had chosen to stand with her. He had chosen to be her protector. It was a realization that sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with the heart. She finished her tea, the liquid warming her from the inside out, and felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude. She had survived the storm, she had survived the town, and she was, for the first time, looking forward to the future. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, filled with the inevitable hardships of frontier life, but she was no longer walking it alone. She had Gideon, and in that she had everything she needed. She moved to the hearth, adding a small log to the fire, watching as the flames licked up against the wood, casting a warm, comforting light into the corners of the cabin. The night deepened, the stars appearing in the vast, open sky above the mountains, bright, cold, and infinite. Evelyn stood at the door, listening to the night sounds, the rustle of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the low, steady creak of the house settling into the ground. It was a familiar, comforting symphony of the plains, a reminder of the world she lived in. She closed the door, locking it, but she felt no fear. The solitude which had once been a source of terror now felt like a sanctuary. It was a place where she could grow, where she could become the woman she was meant to be, with Gideon by her side, a silent, powerful, and unwavering presence. She prepared for sleep, her movements slow and deliberate. She undressed, the soft linen of her shift brushing against her skin, and crawled under the covers, the weight of the blankets a gentle pressure that helped to settle her nerves. As she closed her eyes, the last thing she saw was the image of the mountains, dark and imposing against the starry sky, the home of the man who had changed everything. She drifted off, the sleep of the righteous, of the survivor, of the one who had finally found her place in the world. She dreamed of the wind, but it was not the violent, destructive wind of the storm. It was a gentle, whispering breeze that carried the scent of pine and mountain air, a breeze that guided her home. And in her dream, Gideon was there, standing tall and silent, a pillar of strength that held the sky together, keeping her safe, keeping her warm, keeping her whole. It was a dream of peace, of safety, of a future that held promise rather than threat. When she woke the next morning, the sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. The air was cool and crisp, the remnants of the storm long gone. She rose, her body feeling refreshed and renewed, and went to the window. The world was alive with the promise of a new day. She could see the fence standing tall and proud, the repairs they had made together holding firm against the weight of the morning. It was a small, tangible sign of their success, a testament to the work they had done. She began her morning routine, the familiar tasks of the frontier filling her time. She stoked the fire, prepared breakfast, and tended to the few tasks that remained. But even as she worked, her mind kept returning to Gideon. She thought about his arrival, the way he would appear on the horizon, his silhouette a familiar, comforting sight. She thought about the tasks they would tackle, the plans they would make, the shared life that was just beginning to unfold. It was a future that was full of uncertainty, yes, but it was also full of hope, and for the first time in years, she was ready to face it, with her head held high, her heart open, and her spirit unbroken. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the fresh, clean air of the morning. The valley was waking up, the birds beginning their song, the light filtering through the trees. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, a perfect start to a new chapter of her life. She looked out toward the mountains, the place where he lived, and felt a surge of anticipation. He would be here soon. He had promised, and he was a man of his word. She turned back to the cabin, a light, almost ethereal sense of joy bubbling up inside her. She had been through so much. She had suffered so much, but it had all been for this, for the strength she had found, for the resilience she had built, and for the man who had come into her life and changed everything. She was no longer a widow, no longer an outsider, no longer a burden to be discarded. She was a woman of the frontier, a survivor who had found her match, a partner who stood vacep te hatter in the face of whatever the world might throw their way. The day promised to be a busy one, filled with the demands of homesteading, the labor of survival, and the quiet, steady work of building a life. But as she moved through the hours, she felt a profound sense of ease. The burden of isolation which had pressed down on her for so long had been lifted, replaced by the comfort of companionship and the strength of a shared resolve. She found herself humming as she worked, a soft, tuneless melody that reflected the lightness of her heart. She spent the morning clearing the rest of the debris, her work purposeful and efficient. She had a new perspective on the tasks, a new understanding of the value of her labor. Every chore, every repair, every detail was a step toward the future, a building block for the life she was creating. She was no longer just surviving. She was living with purpose, with intention, and with the support of a man who saw her not for her fragility, but for her strength. As the sun reached its zenith, she paused for a moment of rest, sitting on the porch steps and looking out over the valley. The world was quiet. The only sound, the gentle rustling of the grass in the breeze. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace. She had come so far, overcome so much, and here she was in this place at this time, ready for whatever the future might hold. She was home, and she was not alone. The afternoon hours passed in a blur of activity, the work progressing smoothly and steadily. She was making progress, making headway, making a difference. She felt a sense of pride in her work, a satisfaction that was deep and resonant. She was building something that was her own, something that was lasting, something that would endure. And as she looked out over the land, she felt a connection to it, a kinship that she had never felt before. It was a good life, a hard life, a challenging life, but it was a life that was hers, and she was grateful for it. She was grateful for the challenges, for the trials, for the storms, for they had led her to this moment, to this understanding, to this strength. And she was grateful for Gideon, for his presence, for his protection, for his partnership. He was the anchor that held her steady, the rock that she could rely on, the partner who stood vacep te hatter against the world. As the sun began to sink once again, painting the sky in hues of violet and indigo, she finished her final task of the day. She stood on the porch, looking out at the mountains, the silhouette of the ridge becoming sharper and clearer in the fading light. He would be here soon. She could feel it, the anticipation building in her, the excitement bubbling up in her chest. She was ready. She was waiting. And she was, for the first time, truly alive. The transition to evening was slow and gradual, the light fading into the velvet darkness of the night. She lit the lantern, the warm glow illuminating the porch, a beacon in the quiet, empty landscape. She sat on the porch swing, rocking gently, her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for the shape that she knew would soon appear. It was a patient, expectant vigil, a testament to her resolve, to her trust, to her faith. And then, just as the last of the light faded from the sky, she saw him. A dark, towering silhouette emerging from the tree line, moving with that familiar, steady, purposeful stride. Her heart leaped in her chest, a sudden sharp thrill of recognition. He was here. He had come, just as he had promised, and as he drew closer, his form becoming more distinct, his features sharpened by the lantern light, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. He was here, and everything was going to be all right. He reached the gate, stopping for a moment to survey the cabin, the porch, and then finally her. She stood up, her hand resting on the porch railing, her gaze locked with his. He didn't speak, but his presence was a loud, clear, undeniable declaration of his return. He had come back, he had honored his word, he was here, and he was ready to continue the work, to face the challenges, to build the future they were creating together. She walked to the gate, her stride confident and purposeful, her eyes bright with expectation. She reached out, unlatching the gate and swinging it open, welcoming him into her home, into her space, into her life. He stepped through, his massive frame dwarfing the entrance, his presence filling the air with a sense of security and strength. And as he looked down at her, a rare, faint smile touching his lips, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the night enveloping them, the only sound the gentle rustling of the wind in the trees. It was a moment of profound, wordless communication, a shared understanding that needed no explanation, no justification, no defense. They were partners, they were allies, they were a team, and they were ready for whatever the future might bring. She turned and led the way toward the cabin, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. He followed, his presence a steady, comforting weight behind her. They entered the cabin, the warmth of the fire welcoming them, the atmosphere cozy and intimate. And as he took his seat at the table, the same place he had sat before, she felt a deep, profound sense of rightness. This was how it was meant to be. They spent the evening in comfortable silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the clock. They didn't need to talk. They understood he at Shehat other, the language of their partnership spoken in the quiet, the presence, the shared understanding. It was a beautiful, peaceful evening, a perfect end to a day that had been full of promise and potential. And as she looked at him, the flicker of the firelight dancing in his eyes, she knew that she was home, and she was, for the first time in her life, truly, completely, undeniably, at peace. The silence was not empty. It was full, a rich, vibrant tapestry of shared experiences, mutual respect, and the quiet, steady strength of their burgeoning connection. The days that followed the great dust storm were characterized by a deceptive calm. The sky cleared, turning that brilliant, aching blue that only exists in the hot country, and the air regained its crisp, mountain-chilled clarity. For Evelyn, the homestead began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Every morning she would wake to the sound of hooves thudding against the dry earth, a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat that signaled Gideon's arrival. He was as consistent as the rising sun, appearing at the gate with a quiet, efficient purpose that took the terror out of her daily chores. They worked together hat, a silent, synchronized efficiency that spoke of an understanding far deeper than words. He would repair the roof shingles that had been torn loose, his massive frame dwarfing the cottage, his large, calloused hands manipulating the wood and nails with a dexterity that seemed impossible for a man of his size. She would tend to the garden, the soil now moist, and ready for the seeds she had been too afraid to plant before. But the town of Bitter Creek was not content to let them be. The people there were creatures of habit, and their favorite habit was finding fault with those who didn't fit into the narrow, dusty boxes they had constructed for themselves. When news spread that the silent, towering rancher was spending his days helping the widow, the whispers began. They were like the dry, rustling sound of leaves skittering across a porch, persistent and unsettling. Silas, ever the opportunist and the self-appointed guardian of the town's decency, felt his influence slipping. He had enjoyed the power of making Evelyn feel small, and the fact that she now walked with a new, quiet confidence, a confidence that seemed to radiate directly from the man who stood by her side, rankled him deeply. It started with small things. A look, a pointed remark, the deliberate turning of backs when she walked into the general store. The town was closing ranks, using the only weapons they had: exclusion and cold, calculated judgment. One afternoon, when the pantry was running low on staples, flour, coffee, the simple necessities of life, Evelyn knew she had to face the town. She didn't want to leave the safety of her homestead, but the reality of their survival demanded it. She wore her best dress, the navy calico that she kept pristine, and tied her hair back with a simple ribbon. She felt the weight of her courage as she walked down the path, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm against her ribs. She was not going alone, not really. Gideon, sensing her need, had offered to ride with her. He didn't hover, he didn't coddle. He simply fell into step beside her, his massive presence a silent, immovable wall that warned anyone they kept, but they had half a mind not to try anything. The walk into town was a study in contrasts. The street, usually bustling with the chaotic energy of the frontier, seemed to grow quieter as they approached. Men stopped their work, women pulled their children inside, and the air seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the wood creaked under their combined weight. Hers light and purposeful, his heavy and deliberate. They walked toward the general store, the center of Silas' little kingdom. Silas was there, leaning against the doorframe, his face a mask of practiced indifference that didn't quite hide the flicker of animosity in his eyes. He watched them approach, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a line of stubborn defiance. As they neared, Silas made a performance of his obstruction. He shifted his stance, blocking the doorway, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with a mocking, patronizing smile. He remarked, loud enough for the entire street to hear, that the store was reserved for paying customers, not for strays looking for handouts. He let out a harsh, dry laugh, expecting the usual reaction, the shrinking, the humiliation, the quick retreat. But Evelyn didn't shrink. She stopped, her eyes meeting his with a steady, unflinching gaze. She was the same woman he had bullied weeks ago. She was tempered, hardened by the storm, and anchored by the man beside her. She simply waited, her silence a sharp, clear rebuke to his attempted cruelty. It was Gideon who moved then. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't make a scene. He simply took a single, slow step forward, his immense body eclipsing Silas entirely. He stood, a looming shadow of authority, his slate-gray eyes locking onto the storekeepers with an intensity that seemed to drain the color from the smaller man's face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his presence, the unspoken promise of his protection, was a physical weight that pressed down on Silas, making it impossible for him to maintain his arrogant posture. The storekeeper's bravado crumpled like paper in a fire. He instinctively stepped back, his eyes darting to the side, his shoulders hunching as if trying to shrink away from the giant standing in his path. The silence that followed was total, absolute, and suffocating. The people on the street, watching from behind curtains and store windows, went motionless. It was a masterclass in the power of restraint. Gideon had not touched the man, had not threatened him, had not even frowned. He had simply existed, a force of nature that demanded respect, and in doing so had stripped the bully of his power. Silas, realizing he had been soundly defeated without a single blow being struck, muttered a vague, incoherent apology and retreated into the darkness of the store, disappearing from view like a coward scuttling into a hole. Gideon didn't follow. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to pass, his hand hovering near her elbow, not touching her, but ready to offer support if she needed it. Evelyn walked into the store, her head held high, her breath coming in slow, steady sighs. She gathered what she needed, the task taking only a few moments, the air in the shop feeling surprisingly cool and still. The clerk, terrified by the silent giant waiting just outside the door, served her with trembling hands, his eyes refusing to meet hers. She finished, paid, and stepped back out into the sun. The walk back to the homestead was a victory lap. She didn't look back at the town, didn't check to see who was watching. She knew, she could feel the weight of their gaze, the confusion, the realization that the game had changed. The widow was no longer a widow. She was an equal, a force, a woman who had found her center. And Gideon was still there, walking with her, his presence a constant, reassuring reminder that she was never, ever walking alone. As they reached the gate, the homestead felt even more like a home than it ever had before. They stood for a moment, the silence between them filled with a profound sense of shared accomplishment. Gideon looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, pride. He was proud of her. He had seen her walk into the heart of the enemy's territory and stand her ground, and he had been there to witness it. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both respectful and intimate, and prepared to leave. But this time Evelyn didn't want him to go. She looked at him, the setting sun casting long, beautiful shadows behind him, and she felt a sudden, sharp, and overwhelming urge to hold on to this moment. She asked him if he would stay for supper. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. Gideon stopped, his massive hand on the gate, his gaze searching hers. He saw the hesitation, the hope, the quiet invitation in her eyes. He didn't smile, not broadly, but his eyes softened, the slate-gray warmth deepening, the harsh lines around his mouth relaxing into something gentle. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that was the only acceptance she needed. The evening that followed was a blur of simple domestic bliss. They moved through the cabin, their actions synchronized, a dance of two people who had found a rhythm that worked. She cooked, he helped, the tasks blending into one another in a seamless, comfortable flow. The smell of stew filled the room, a warm, savory scent that seemed to chase away the last of the dust and the bitterness of the day. They sat at the table, the fire crackling in the hearth, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. They talked for the first time about things other than the weather or the work. They talked about the life he had led, the reasons he had chosen to live in the Hat Mountains, the stories of the peaks and the valleys. He spoke of the solitude, the peace, the way the world seemed so much larger, so much more significant when you were standing at the top of the world. He spoke of the winters, the long, quiet nights, the way the snow muffled the world and forced you to look inside, to confront the things you usually ignored. He spoke of his own losses, the way the mountain had taught him to endure, to survive, to be patient. Evelyn listened, her heart aching for the loneliness he had endured, but also marveling at the strength he had built from it. She told him about her own life, the dreams she had carried, the tragedy that had brought her west, the fears that had haunted her for so long. She didn't try to hide her vulnerability, didn't try to mask the pain of her past. She laid it out, piece by piece, a map of her own journey, and he listened, his eyes fixed on hers, his presence an unwavering, non-judgmental anchor. It was a conversation that went deeper than words, a communion of spirits that felt as ancient and as natural as the mountains themselves. They were two broken, lonely people who had found in each other a way to heal, a way to become whole again. The night stretched out, the fire dying down to embers, the stars outside casting a pale, ethereal light through the windows. They didn't notice the time to care about the world outside. They were in their own space, a sanctuary they had built together. As the night grew late and the chill of the high country began to seep into the room, Gideon finally rose to leave. He stood, his immense body filling the space, his movement still and controlled. He looked down at her, his gaze lingering for a moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the evening, of the connection, of the hope that was beginning to bloom between them. He turned to the door, stepping out into the cool, crisp air of the night, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the starlit sky. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching him go. She didn't feel lonely, she didn't feel afraid. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace. She had a partner, an ally, a guardian. She had a man who saw her, understood her, and stood with her against the world. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that no matter what the future held, no matter what the town did, no matter what the world threw at them, they would be ready. They would be together. The next morning, she woke with a sense of purpose. She had work to do, chores to finish, a life to build. She felt stronger, more capable, more resilient than she ever had before. She moved through the house, the light filtering in through the windows, the world outside alive with the promise of a new day. She walked out onto the porch, looking out at the valley, the mountains standing silent and strong in the distance. She saw him coming down the trail, his figure moving with that familiar, steady, purposeful stride. He was coming back, just as he had promised, and as she watched him, she felt a wave of joy, a pure, unadulterated happiness that bubbled up inside her. She wasn't waiting for a savior. She was waiting for a partner, and he was here. He reached the gate, stopping, his gaze finding hers. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The look on his face, the tilt of his head, the way he stood, all of it was a testament to his commitment, to his presence, to his unwavering support. He was here, and he was ready. They worked through the day, the rhythm of their partnership established, the tasks flowing into one another. They were a team, a unit, a force to be reckoned with. They were not just surviving. They were building, creating, forging a future that was theirs and theirs alone. And as the sun began to set, casting its golden light over the valley, they stood together on the porch, looking out at the world, their shadows blending into one, a single, powerful, and undeniable testament to their strength, their resilience, and their bond. The town of Bitter Creek was still there. The whispers were still out there. The judgment was still a reality. But it didn't matter. They had each other. They had their home. They had their work. and they had the promise of a future that was full of potential, a future that they were building together, one day, one task, one moment at a time. The storm had passed, the dust had settled, and they were standing together, strong, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. As the night fell and the stars appeared in the vast open sky, Evelyn felt a sense of belonging that she had never known before. She was home, she was loved, she was safe, and she knew in the deepest part of her heart that this was only the beginning. The journey they were on was long, arduous, and challenging, but it was a journey that she was happy to be on, especially with Gideon by her side. He was the anchor, the rock, the partner, the protector, and as they stood there in the quiet of the night, she knew that she had everything she needed. The world could be what it wanted to be, but in this place, at this time, with this man, she was whole. The fire inside the cabin was a welcoming, warm light against the dark, and as they turned to enter, the warmth of the home felt like a literal manifestation of their bond. She walked through the door, his large, solid frame following close behind, and the sense of completeness that washed over her was overwhelming. They sat down, the evening meal prepared and waiting, a shared effort that had brought them together in a way that nothing else could. They ate in a comfortable, easy silence, the only sound the soft clinking of silverware against plates and the crackle of the wood in the stove. It was a silence that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying. They didn't need to fill the space with words. They didn't need to justify their presence. They didn't need to explain their choices. They simply existed together, a unit, a couple, a pair. After the meal, they sat by the fire, the glow of the flames casting a warm, soft light on their faces. Gideon spoke of his plans for the spring, the work that needed to be done, the improvements he was thinking of making to his own ranch. Evelyn listened, her mind already spinning with ideas of her own, the collaboration and the sharing of their visions a natural, exciting evolution of their connection. They talked about the land, the crops, the animals, the life they were building, their shared future a canvas that they were painting together, brushstroke by brushstroke. It was a night of planning, of dreaming, of building a shared reality, and as the hours passed and the fire burned low, the sense of unity and shared purpose was profound. They were no longer two separate lives. They were becoming something new, something together, something stronger and more resilient than they could ever be apart. As the night drew to a close, and it was time for Gideon to head back, they walked to the door together. The air was cool and crisp, the sky clear and star-filled. They stood on the porch for a moment, the silence of the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the connection they had built, the journey they were on, and the promise of the future. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The look on his face, the way he stood, the way he looked at her, all of it was a testament to his presence, his commitment, his support. He turned and began the walk back, his silhouette a powerful, dark shape against the night. Evelyn watched him, her heart full, her spirit soaring. She was not just surviving, she was living, and she was not alone. She turned and went back inside, the warmth of the cabin welcoming her. She went to bed, her mind still spinning with the thoughts of their conversation, the plans they had made, the shared future that was unfolding before them. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace. She was home. She was loved. She was safe. And she knew in the deepest part of her heart that this was only the beginning. The journey they were on was long, arduous, and challenging, but it was a journey that she was happy to be on, especially with Gideon by her side. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, the dreams that followed soft, gentle, and full of promise. She was no longer the widow of Bitter Creek. She was a woman of the frontier, a survivor who had found her match, a partner who stood vekep hatter in the face of whatever the world might throw their way. She was ready, and she was for the first time in her life, truly, completely, undeniably at peace. The next morning, she woke with the same sense of purpose, the same lightheartedness, the same joy. She went about her day with a renewed energy, the tasks that had once seemed daunting now easily accomplished. She was stronger, more capable, more resilient, and she knew that she was ready for whatever the day might bring. She spent the morning working in the garden, the seeds she had planted now beginning to show signs of life, a tiny, fragile yet persistent testament to her hope, to her faith, to her resilience. She looked out over the homestead, the fence she had helped repair standing firm and tall, the garden thriving, the cabin warm and welcoming. She saw the evidence of her work, the tangible proof of her effort, the symbol of her life. She was proud of what she had achieved, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the life she was building. And she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready. She was ready for the challenges, the trials, the storms, for she knew that she would face them with Gideon, her rock, her guardian, her partner. She was ready for the future, for the promise, for the hope, for she knew that she would build it vekeppetehatum, step by step, day by day, moment by moment. She was ready for life, for the beauty, for the struggle, for the journey, for she knew that it would be shared, that it would be meaningful, and that it would be hers and his and theirs together. The town of Bitter Creek could whisper, could judge, could try to intimidate, but they could not shake the foundation that she had built. They could not touch the strength she had found, the resilience she had developed, the bond she had formed. They were irrelevant, their petty grievances and their small-minded judgments, nothing more than the noise of the wind, the dust of the road, the fleeting, insignificant distractions in the face of the truth that she and Gideon had created. She stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the clear, crisp mountain air, and felt the power of the land, the strength of the mountains, the resilience of the life she was living. She was a part of this place, this world, and she was at last where she belonged. And as she looked toward the mountains, the home of the man who had come into her life and changed everything, she knew that she was not just surviving. She was, finally, truly and completely alive. And that was all that mattered. The transition of the season was upon them, the late autumn air turning crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of pine needles and distant frost. In the town of Bitter Creek, the rhythm of life began to shift toward the harvest, that time of year when the community gathered to celebrate the bounty of the earth and, more importantly, to reinforce the social lines that held the town together. It was during this season that the town decided to host its annual harvest social, a grand affair meant to be a display of unity and prosperity. But for those who didn't fit the mold, for the drifters, the widowers, the outsiders, it was a pointed reminder of their exclusion. The invitations were sent to the respectable families, to the ranch owners with established legacies, and to the merchants who held the town as purse strings. Evelyn, living on the edge of the foothills, was pointedly left off the list. It was a subtle, cruel kind of message, the sort of social maneuver that didn't leave a mark but stung nonetheless. Silas, emboldened by the camaraderie of the town leaders, made sure the word got out that the social was an intimate gathering, reserved for those who had invested in the town's future. He spent his afternoons leaning against the storefront, letting it be known with a smirk and a sharp word that some people simply didn't belong in polite company. He watched the horizon, waiting to see if the widow would try to show her face, his heart already prepared with a cutting remark, a way to publicly solidify her status as an outcast. He wanted to see her shrink, to see her acknowledge the boundaries he had drawn. He wanted the town to see her as a pitiable, fragile thing who had no right to walk the boardwalk of their society. But he had failed to account for one thing. He had failed to account for the presence of the man who now stood in the shadow of the widow's cabin. Gideon, when he heard of the whispers in town, didn't react with anger. He didn't erupt or seek confrontation. He simply looked at Evelyn, his slate-gray eyes steady and calm, and asked her if she wanted to go. It wasn't a suggestion of defiance. It was an offer of partnership. If she wanted to walk into the center of the town's judgment, he would be there to ensure she didn't have to face it alone. He would be the wall she could lean on, the shadow that would stretch over her, the presence that would demand they be acknowledged as a pair. Evelyn, looking at him, felt the last vestiges of her fear begin to dissolve. She realized that the town's exclusion was no longer a cage. It was an irrelevance. The only approval she needed, the only community she valued, was the one she was building with this quiet, immense man who had taught her more about dignity in a few short weeks than the town had in all her time there. She decided to go. Not to win their favor. She didn't care for it anymore. But to claim the right to exist in the world on her own terms, with the man she had chosen by her side. The evening of the social arrived, the sky a deep bruised violet, the air biting with the first chill of winter. Evelyn dressed vekepte care, not in the fine silks of the city, but in a simple, modest dress she had repaired and cleaned, a garment that spoke of her resilience, her attention to detail, and her quiet, dignified beauty. She felt a nervous flutter in her chest, not of fear, but of anticipation. She stood before her small, cracked mirror, smoothing her hair, and felt a moment of profound gratitude for the woman staring back at her. That woman had survived the dust storm, she had survived the loneliness, and she was, in this moment, ready to face the world. Gideon arrived on time, his horse walking with a slow, heavy gait that seemed to match the gravity of his own demeanor. He was wearing his best clothes, a dark, clean shirt, and a coat that fit his massive frame with a rugged elegance. He didn't say much, just a low, appreciative nod as he saw her, but his eyes said everything. He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply, profoundly protective. As she took his arm, she felt the strength of his muscles beneath her hand, a solid, immovable support that made her feel, for the first time in her life, invincible. The journey into town was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythmic clip-clop of the hooves on the hard-packed trail. The air was cold, but nestled against him she felt a heat that radiated from his body, a warmth that seemed to keep the chill at bay. They arrived at the town hall, the building brightly lit, the sound of music and laughter spilling out into the dark night. It was a jarring contrast to the silence they had left behind, a chaotic, loud, and demanding world. As they dismounted and walked toward the entrance, the atmosphere outside the hall seemed to change. The people loitering near the doorway stopped their chatter, their eyes widening as they caught sight of the pair. It wasn't just that the widow was here, it was who she was with. Gideon, the silent rancher, the man who was known for his distance, was here, accompanying her, his arm held out for her to lean on, his presence a clear, unwavering signal of his allegiance. They walked up the steps, the wood creaking beneath their boots, a sound that seemed to carry through the quiet air. Silas, who had been holding court near the door, fell silent, his face shifting from smug anticipation to a mask of shock and irritation. He watched them approach, his body stiffening, his hand instinctively reaching for the frame of the door, as if he were trying to physically block their entry. But he stopped, his gaze meeting Gideon's, and saw the same stillness, the same intensity, the same power that had silenced him once before. He couldn't sustain his defiance. He stepped back, his presence retreating into the shadows of the hall, and for a moment the way was clear. They walked inside. The music faltered for a second, a ripple of confusion moving through the room, but then, under the steady calm and utterly unbothered presence of the man beside her, the room settled back into an uneasy, watchful rhythm. Evelyn felt the weight of their gaze, the curiosity, the judgment, but it didn't matter. She looked up at Gideon, and he looked down at her, a silent, powerful, and undeniable declaration that they were here, together, and that they belonged exactly where they were. They didn't dance, they didn't need to. They simply stood together near the edge of the room, a quiet, immovable anchor in the middle of the social, chaotic energy. They held their own space, their conversation soft, private, and entirely removed from the drama of the room. It was a moment of profound, wordless connection, a communion that felt like a quiet, intimate sanctuary in the middle of the storm of social expectation. They watched the people, the dance, the laughter, but they were not of it. They were something else, something apart, something uniquely their own. People approached them tentatively at first, curious, trying to gauge the nature of their relationship. Gideon answered in his usual way, with short, polite, and entirely non-committal words. He didn't engage in the gossip, didn't indulge the speculation, didn't offer any justification. He simply stood there, his massive form providing a shelter, a barrier, a constant, reassuring presence that made the questions seem trivial, the gossip meaningless, the judgment hollow. Evelyn, for her part, met their eyes with a steady, serene gaze, her smile polite, her demeanor composed, her inner strength radiating from her with a power that made the people around them feel, inexplicably, a little bit diminished. It was a masterclass in silent power. They didn't have to defend themselves. They didn't have to argue their worth. They didn't have to prove their place. They simply were. And in that state of being, in that acceptance of themselves and each other, they achieved a victory that no argument, no confrontation, no battle could have provided. They were the masters of their own destiny, the architects of their own lives, the protectors of their own peace. As the night wore on, the initial shock of their arrival began to wear off, the rhythm of the social returning to its usual predictable pattern. But the dynamic had fundamentally changed. The townspeople were no longer looking at Evelyn as a target. They were looking at her as an enigma, a woman who had somehow, in some impossible way, earned the protection and the partnership of the most formidable man in the territory. They were no longer judging her. They were, in their own way, beginning to respect her. They left early, slipping out of the hall as quietly as they had arrived, the night air a refreshing, cool, and liberating embrace. The walk back to their horses was a walk of quiet satisfaction, a shared acknowledgement of the victory they had achieved. They hadn't fought the battle. They had simply stood their ground, and in doing so they had won. The ride home was quiet, the moon casting long silver shadows across the landscape, the world bathed in a peaceful, serene light. They didn't talk much, the weight of the evening's events settling into a comfortable, easy silence. It was a silence that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying, a testament to the journey they were on, the bond they were building, and the future they were creating. When they arrived back at the cabin, the stillness of the homestead was a welcome, restorative embrace. They stood in the dark, the silhouette of the mountains rising high and clear against the star-filled sky, the world feeling vast, open, and full of possibility. Gideon helped her down, his hand firm, steady, and gentle, and as he stood there, his massive form filling the air with a sense of security and strength, Evelyn felt a wave of peace that she had never known before. He didn't leave immediately. He lingered, his presence a constant, reassuring force, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. He said that he was glad she had come, that she had shown them who she was, that she had refused to hide. It was a rare, direct compliment, a testament to his respect, to his belief in her, to his acknowledgement of her strength. Evelyn, looking at him, felt a rush of affection that was deep, profound, and entirely her own. She told him that she couldn't have done it without him, that he had been the rock, the anchor, the partner she had needed. She told him that he had changed everything, that he had given her the strength to believe in herself, the power to stand her ground, the ability to see her own worth. He didn't say anything, but his silence was a powerful, eloquent, and deeply moving response. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, a touch that was surprisingly beautifully and tenderly gentle. It was a gesture that spoke of intimacy, of connection, of shared vulnerability, of a bond that was in its essence a testament to their mutual healing. They stood there for a long moment, the silence of the night wrapping around them, the world feeling distant, irrelevant, and inconsequential. They were together, they were partners, they were a unit, and they were, in that moment, the only people in the world. As he finally turned to leave, his walk taking him back toward the mountains, the solitude he retreated into feeling less like a retreat and more like a space he was holding for her, Evelyn felt a sense of anticipation, of hope, of purpose. She had a future that she was building, step by step, day by day, and she had a partner, a man who stood with her, a guardian who protected her, a rock who held her steady. She had at last found her way, and she was, for the first time in her life, truly, completely, and undeniably alive. The next morning, the sun rose over the valley, painting the sky in colors of gold and amber, the day full of promise, of potential, of the work she loved. She moved through the house, the light filtering in through the windows, the world outside alive with the vibrant energy of the season. She felt stronger, more capable, more resilient, and she knew that she was ready for whatever the day might bring. She spent the morning in the garden, the seeds she had planted now beginning to sprout, a tiny, fragile, yet persistent testament to her hope, to her faith, to her resilience. She looked out over the homestead, the fence standing firm and tall, the garden thriving, the cabin warm and welcoming. She saw the evidence of her work, the tangible proof of her effort, the symbol of her life. She was proud of what she had achieved, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the life she was building. And she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready. She was ready for the challenges, the trials, the storms, for she knew that she would face them with Gideon, her rock, her guardian, her partner. She was ready for the future, for the promise, for the hope, for she knew that she would build it him, step by step, day by day, moment by moment. She was ready for life, for the beauty, for the struggle, for the journey, for she knew that it would be shared, that it would be meaningful, and that it would be hers and his and theirs together. The town of Bitter Creek could whisper, could judge, could try to intimidate, but they could not shake the foundation that she had built. They could not touch the strength she had found, the resilience she had developed, the bond she had formed. They were irrelevant, their petty grievances and their small-minded judgments, nothing more than the noise of the wind, the dust of the road, the fleeting, insignificant distractions in the face of the truth that she and Gideon had created. She stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the clear, crisp mountain air, and felt the power of the land, the strength of the mountains, the resilience of the life she was living. She was a part of this place, this world, and she was at last where she belonged. And as she looked toward the mountains, the home of the man who had come into her life and changed everything, she knew that she was not just surviving. She was, finally, truly, and completely alive. And that was all that mattered. The day flowed into the next and the next, a rhythm of living that felt as natural as the turning of the tides. The harvest arrived in earnest, the fields yielding their bounty, the homestead alive with the activity of gathering, storing, and preparing for the winter. Gideon was there every day, his strength, his skill, his unwavering support, an integral part of everything they did. They worked together, side by side, their movements complementary, their labor shared, their connection deepening. They kept hat every task they completed, every challenge they met, every moment they spent together. It was a life of hard work, of simple pleasures, of deep, profound meaning. They shared their meals, their stories, their dreams, their fears, their hopes. They built a world that was theirs, a world that was defined by their partnership, their resilience, their strength, their love. And as the days grew shorter, the nights longer, the winter approaching, they were ready, prepared, fortified, and strengthened, not just by the preparations they had made, but by the bond they had formed. The silence of the winter was something they Beotehat cherished, a space that allowed them to be themselves, to explore their thoughts, to deepen their understanding of one another. They spent the evenings by the fire, the glow of the flames illuminating their faces, the warmth of the cabin a literal manifestation of their bond. They spoke of the past, the present, the future, their conversations an exploration of their souls, a testament to the depth of their understanding, the strength of their connection. It was a life that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying, a life that was defined by the things that truly mattered, the work, the connection, the resilience, the hope, the love. And as the winter settled in, the snow falling softly, the world outside a pristine, white, and beautiful landscape, they were there, together, in the warmth of their cabin, in the heart of their home, in the sanctuary they had built, together one day, one task, one moment at a time. The blizzard that hit in the middle of the winter was a testament to the scale of the world they lived in. A storm that was larger, more powerful, more relentless than any they had known before. But they were ready. They were prepared. They were fortified, not just by the supplies they had gathered, the firewood they had stacked, the cabin they had reinforced, but by each other. They faced the storm together, their resilience, their courage, their strength, their bond, a bulwark against the elements, a foundation that held firm, a force that endured, a light that shone, a promise that remained. The storm raged for days, the world outside a chaotic, swirling, white abyss, the wind a relentless, punishing force that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. But inside, they were calm, prepared, together their lives intertwined, their spirits aligned, their purpose clear. They spent the days in the quiet, focused on the work, the chores, the simple, essential tasks of living, their movements a dance of shared purpose, of mutual respect, of deep, enduring affection. The long, quiet nights were a time of reflection, of connection, of shared intimacy, the fire their only source of light, their only companion, the warmth that provided a symbol of the bond that sustained them. They spoke of the world, the life, the future, their dreams, their aspirations, their fears, their hopes, their conversations and exploration of their souls, a testament to the depth of their understanding, the strength of their connection, the power of their love. When the storm finally passed, the world was changed, transformed, renewed, a blank white canvas waiting to be written upon. They stepped out into the pristine, still, and breathtaking landscape, the air sharp, clear, and exhilarating, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding, brilliant, and beautiful light. They were alive, they were safe, they were together, and they were ready, prepared, fortified, and strengthened, not just by the storm they had endured, but by the bond they had forged, the resilience they had demonstrated, the life they were building. The path ahead was long, challenging, and filled with the unknown, the unpredictability of the frontier, the harshness of the elements, the uncertainty of the future. But they were not afraid. They were not alone. They were together, a unit, a force to be reckoned with, a partnership that was as strong, as resilient, as enduring as the mountains themselves. As they walked through the snow, the silence of the winter landscape a testament to the peace they had found, the life they were building, the future they were creating. They were ready for whatever the next chapter might hold. They were ready for the spring, the renewal, the growth, the change, the challenge, the joy, the struggle, the journey. They were ready for life, for it was a life that was theirs, and they were, together, truly, completely, and undeniably at peace. They stood there in the vast, open expanse, the mountains rising high and clear against the blue sky, the world a beautiful, quiet, and peaceful landscape. And as they looked at Ia Shehat Other, the understanding, the trust, the love, the connection, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had found their place, their home, their sanctuary, their purpose, their future, and they had found Ia Shehat Other, the partner, the guardian, the rock, the love, the life, the dream, the reality, the journey, the truth. The path ahead was theirs to walk, the future theirs to create, the life theirs to live. And as they turned to walk back to their home, their steps synchronized, their rhythm shared, their journey together a testament to the resilience, the strength, the hope, the faith, the love, the life that they had built, they knew that they were ready, prepared, fortified, and strengthened for whatever the future might hold, for it was a future that was theirs, and they were, together, at peace. The sun began to set, casting long gold and amber shadows across the snow, the world a peaceful, quiet, and beautiful landscape. And as they looked at the cabin, their home, their sanctuary, their heart, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be, in the place that they had built, together one day, one task, one moment at a time. And as they walked through the door, the warmth of the hearth welcoming them, the home that they had built, the sanctuary that they had found, the life that they had lived, they were, together, finally, truly, and completely, at home. The winter had been long, a silent white sentinel that guarded the peaks and turned the valley into a world of crystalline stillness. But as the sun began to climb higher in the sky and the days stretched, lengthening their reach, the thaw began. It was not a sudden event, but a slow, rhythmic return of life. The creek, which had been locked in ice, began to murmur, then babble, then roar with the meltwater of the high peaks. The earth, long frozen and hard as iron, softened, turning into rich, dark mud that smelled of ancient potential. And as the world outside changed, so too did the atmosphere between Evelyn and Gideon. The storm that had trapped them together, the town's cold judgment they had weathered, and the deep, silent winter they had spent as anchors for Ia Shehat Other had worn away the outer layers of their defenses. They were no longer the cautious, fearful people they had been when they first met. They were something else, something forged, something tempered, something deeply, fundamentally connected. Yet, despite the ease that had grown between them, there were still ghosts lingering in the corners of their conversations. Gideon, the mountain of a man who could stare down a storm and walk through a blizzard without faltering, still carried a weight that he hadn't yet shared. He was a man who had built his life on the idea of solitude, on the belief that to be alone was to be safe from the pain of disappointing others. One afternoon, while the sun was bathing the porch in a golden, warming light and the first green shoots of spring were beginning to push through the soil of Evelyn S. garden, they sat together on the wooden bench. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was not the heavy, awkward silence of their early days, but a comfortable, companionable quiet. Evelyn watched him, her gaze tracing the rugged lines of his face, the way his dark beard caught the light, the intensity that always seemed to simmer just beneath the surface of his slate-gray eyes. She felt a sudden, profound urge to know the man behind the giant, to understand the heart that beat so steadily within that massive, broad chest. She reached out, her hand light as a feather, and rested it on his forearm. The muscles beneath her fingers were like steel, dense and unyielding, but the gesture was soft, an invitation. She asked him why he had really chosen the mountains, why he had cut himself off from the rest of the world so completely, long before she had ever arrived. Gideon went still. He didn't pull away, but the tension in his frame shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that Evelyn sensed immediately. He stared out at the horizon, his gaze fixed on the jagged peaks where he spent his days. The silence stretched, long and deep, filled with the sounds of the thawing valley, the call of a distant hawk, the trickle of the stream, the rustle of the wind in the trees. He didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing the cost of the truth, measuring it against the trust he had built with this delicate, resilient woman who had become the anchor of his own life. Finally, he began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. He talked about his youth, about a time when he had tried to build a life in the valley, when he had tried to take on the responsibilities of a family, a farm, a community. He spoke of a failure, not a failure of character, but a failure of protection. He had taken on too much, had promised too much, and when the hard times came, the drought, the blight, the sickness, he hadn't been enough. He had watched as the people he cared for suffered, and he had carried the weight of that suffering on his own shoulders, a burden that had nearly crushed him. He had convinced himself that he was a danger to anyone he tried to hold close, that his strength was a lure that promised safety but delivered only heartbreak. So, he had retreated. He had gone to the mountains, where the only thing he had to protect was himself, where the only thing he had to lose was his own life, where he could be the silent, solitary force that asked for nothing and gave nothing but the strength of his own labor. As he spoke, Evelyn felt her heart break for him. She saw the pain he had been carrying, the years of self-imposed exile, the heavy, lonely burden of a guilt that was his to bear. She realized that his giant size, his immense strength, his stoic, silent demeanor, it was all a shield. It was a way to keep the world at bay, a way to ensure that he would never again be in a position where he could fail someone he loved. He had been so afraid of his own limitations that he had denied himself the very thing he needed most, the companionship, the partnership, the shared life that was his birthright. She felt a surge of love for him so powerful it nearly took her breath away. She didn't offer empty words of comfort, didn't try to dismiss the pain he felt, because she knew that for a man like Gideon, sympathy was an insult. Instead, she tightened her hold on his arm, her touch a firm, deliberate statement of her presence, of her understanding. She told him that he was wrong. She told him that the people he had tried to protect hadn't blamed him, that they hadn't seen him as a failure, that he had been the rock they had leaned on, the strength they had relied on. She told him that his fear was a liar, that it had taken the best years of his life and locked them away in the cold, thin air of the mountains. She shared her own story, not the version she had told the townsfolk, but the deeper, more painful truth. She told him about her own past, about the woman who had been so afraid of her own vulnerability, who had believed that to be soft, to be fragile, to be beautiful was to be a target. She had spent her life trying to hide her true self, trying to be the person that others expected, the dutiful wife, the obedient daughter, the quiet, unobtrusive widow. She had believed that her fragility was a weakness, that it made her small, that it made her irrelevant. But here with him, she had learned that her softness was not a weakness. It was a strength. It was the quality that allowed her to endure, to survive, to heal, to love. As she laid her soul bare, she saw the shift in him. The tension in his shoulders relaxed, the hard, defensive light in his eyes softened, the barrier he had built around himself beginning to crumble. He looked at her, and for the first time he really saw her. He saw the resilience in her slender frame, the fire in her sapphire eyes, the depth of her spirit. He saw that she was not a prize to be protected, a fragile thing to be coddled. She was a partner, an equal, a woman who had walked through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. The weight of their shared history, the burden of their pasts, the ache of their loneliness. It all began to lift, replaced by the realization that they were no longer two separate, wounded people trying to survive. They were two parts of a whole, two sides of the same coin, two souls who had finally found the missing pieces of their own lives in each other. It was a realization that was quiet, profound, and deeply moving. They sat there on the porch, the sun beginning to set, casting long, gold, and amber shadows across the valley, and in the silence they found a level of intimacy that went deeper than words, deeper than touch, deeper than the physical reality of their presence. It was a moment of profound, wordless communication, a meeting of minds, a communion of spirits. They didn't need to speak, they didn't need to explain, they didn't need to justify. They simply existed, together in the truth of the moment, in the beauty of their connection, in the promise of their shared future. And as the sun finally slipped behind the mountains, the sky a vibrant, brilliant display of violet, indigo, and orange, they were there, together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of their interaction shifted again. It was no longer about the work, the repairs, the survival, though those things were still part of their lives. It was about the way they looked at Iage Hot Other, the way they moved together, the way they communicated without needing to say a word. It was a subtle, beautiful evolution, a blossoming of the bond they had formed. The town of Bitter Creek, observing from a distance, began to change its tune as well. The whispers that had once been filled with malice now held a hint of curiosity, a begrudging respect, a silent acknowledgement of the fact that the widow and the giant were no longer just survivors. They were a fixture, a reality, a presence that could no longer be ignored or diminished. Silas, the merchant who had tried to build his reputation on the downfall of others, found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to stir up trouble, to plant seeds of doubt, to undermine the couple's standing, fell flat. The people were tired of the bitterness, tired of the games, tired of the constant petty judgment. They were beginning to see the value of what Evelyn and Gideon had built, the stability, the strength, the peace. They were beginning to understand that their own lives, their own community, their own world was better when it was defined not by who they excluded, but by who they included. One afternoon, when the spring was in full bloom and the valley was alive with the vibrant colors of the season, a group of the town's elders came to the gate of the homestead. They were men of status, of influence, of standing, men who had in the past been part of the chorus of judgment. But today, they were different. They stood at the gate, their hats in their hands, their demeanor respectful, hesitant, almost humble. They spoke of the work that had been done, the contribution that had been made, the presence that had been established. They spoke of the need for stability, for community, for a sense of shared purpose in the valley. Gideon, the man who had spent years avoiding the very idea of community, listened, his expression neutral, his posture still, his presence as calm and as grounded as the earth beneath his feet. Evelyn stood beside him, her presence as steady and as confident as his. They didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't demand. They simply listened, their silence a powerful, eloquent, and deeply moving testament to the truth of their own lives. When the elders finished, they offered a gesture of inclusion, an invitation to participate, an acknowledgement of the role that they played in the life of the valley. It was a significant moment, a turning point, a validation of the journey they had been on. They didn't accept the invitation immediately. They didn't commit to anything. They didn't change their lives, but they acknowledged the gesture. They accepted the respect that was offered, the recognition that was given. They understood that the world had changed, that they had changed, and that the relationship between them and the community would, from this point on, be on their own terms. It was a victory, not a battle won, but a position established, a foundation laid, a reality recognized. As the elders left, the homestead felt quiet again, peaceful, settled. Evelyn and Gideon stood on the porch, watching them disappear down the trail, the sun high in the sky, the valley humming with the vibrant energy of the season. They looked at each other, and in that look there was a shared understanding, a mutual respect, a deep, abiding, and profound affection. They had done it. They had weathered the storm. They had stood their ground. They had built their sanctuary, and they had, in their own time, on their own terms, claimed their place in the world. It was a realization that filled Evelyn Veikep-Tehat a deep, profound sense of gratitude. She had come so far, overcome so much, and here she was in this place at this time, ready for whatever the future might hold. She was home, and she was not alone. She had Gideon, the man who had come into her life and changed everything, the partner who stood Veikep-Tehat her, the guardian who protected her, the rock who held her steady. She had at last found her way. The spring flowed into summer, a season of warmth, of light, of abundance, of life. The homestead thrived, the garden a lush, vibrant, and productive display of the care and the effort that had been put into it. The cabin was a home, a sanctuary, a place of warmth, of comfort, of peace. And as they lived their lives, day by day, moment by moment, they continued to grow, to learn, to change, to deepen their connection, to build their world together. It was a life that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying. A life that was defined by the things that truly mattered, the work, the connection, the resilience, the hope, the love. And as the days grew longer, the sun warmer, the world outside a vibrant, living, and beautiful landscape. They were there together, in the warmth of their cabin, the heart of their home, in the sanctuary they had built, together. They spent their days working, their evenings talking, their nights sleeping in the peace and the security of their home. They were no longer two separate lives. They were becoming something new, something together, something stronger and more resilient than they could ever be apart. It was a life that was defined by the depth of their understanding, the strength of their connection, the power of their love. And as the summer deepened, the nights warm, the stars bright, the air filled with the sounds of the night. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of the leaves, the distant, steady, and rhythmic heartbeat of the valley. They were there together in the peace and the security of their home. It was a life that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying, a life that was defined by the things that truly mattered: the work, the connection, the resilience, the hope, the love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon, the sky a breathtaking display of color, Gideon turned to her. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were filled with a look she had come to know, a look of profound, abiding, and deep affection. He reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused, and strong hand enveloping her own. It was a gesture that was both simple and deeply, profoundly meaningful. He told her in his quiet, low, and resonant voice that he had never expected to find what he had found. He had never expected to find a partner, a friend, a love, a life. He had never expected to be able to share his world, his heart, his life with someone else. He had never expected to be able to trust, to open up, to let someone in, to be seen, to be known, to be understood. He said that he was grateful every single day for the moment they had met, for the storm that had brought them together, for the path that had led them to this moment. Evelyn, listening, felt the tears well up in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears of joy, of gratitude, of love. She told him that she was grateful too. She told him that she had never expected to find what she had found either. She had never expected to find a protector, a partner, a love, a life. She had never expected to be able to share her world, her heart, her life with someone else. She had never expected to be able to trust, to open up, to let someone in, to be seen, to be known, to be understood. She said that she was grateful every single day for the moment they had met, for the storm that had brought them together, for the path that had led them to this moment. They sat there, hand in hand, the sun setting, the world becoming quiet, the light fading into the velvet darkness of the night, their connection a testament to the journey they had been on, the bond they had built, the future they were creating. It was a moment of profound, wordless communication, a meeting of minds, a communion of spirits, a testament to the depth of their understanding, the strength of their connection, the power of their love. They were no longer two separate lives. They were becoming something new, something together, something stronger and more resilient than they could ever be apart. It was a life that was defined by the depth of their understanding, the strength of their connection, the power of their love. And as the night fell, the stars appeared in the vast open sky above the mountains, bright, cold, and infinite. They were there together in the peace and the security of their home. The path ahead was long, challenging, and filled with the unknown, the unpredictability of the frontier, the harshness of the elements, the uncertainty of the future. But they were not afraid. They were not alone. They were together, a unit, a force to be reckoned with, a partnership that was as strong, as resilient, as enduring as the mountains themselves. As they turned to enter the cabin, the warmth of the hearth welcoming them, the home that they had built, the sanctuary that they had found, the life that they had lived, they were, together, finally, truly, and completely at home. And as they stood there, in the warmth of the room, the fire crackling, the light dancing, the world outside a vast, open, and beautiful landscape, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. They had found their place, their home, their sanctuary, their purpose, their future, and they had found Iegjehat other, the partner, the guardian, the rock, the love, the life, the dream, the reality, the journey, the truth. And as they stood there together, the silence of the night wrapping around them, the world feeling distant, irrelevant, and inconsequential, they knew that they were, and always would be, together. The journey they had been on, the trials they had faced, the storms they had weathered, the life they had built. It was all a testament to the strength, the resilience, the hope, the faith, the love, the life that they had forged. And as they walked through the door, the final, closing, and permanent mark of their commitment to each other, they were, together, ready for whatever the future might hold, for it was a future that was theirs, and they were, together, at peace. The fire inside the cabin was a welcoming, warm light against the dark, and as they moved through the room, the sense of completeness that washed over her was overwhelming. They sat down, the evening meal prepared and waiting, a shared effort that had brought them together in a way that nothing else could. They ate in a comfortable, easy silence, the only sound the soft clinking of silverware against plates and the crackle of the wood in the stove. It was a silence that was rich, full, and deeply satisfying. They didn't need to fill the space with words. They didn't need to justify their presence. They didn't need to explain their choices. They simply existed, together, a unit, a couple, a pair. After the meal, they sat by the fire, the glow of the flames casting a warm, soft light on their faces. Gideon spoke of his plans for the spring, the work that needed to be done, the improvements he was thinking of making to his own ranch. Evelyn listened, her mind already spinning with ideas of her own, the collaboration and the sharing of their visions, a natural, exciting evolution of their connection. They talked about the land, the crops, the animals, the life they were building, their shared future, a canvas that they were painting together, brushstroke by brushstroke. It was a night of planning, of dreaming, of building a shared reality. And as the hours passed and the fire burned low, the sense of unity and shared purpose was profound. They were no longer two separate lives. They were becoming something new, something together, something stronger and more resilient than they could ever be apart. As the night drew to a close, and it was time for Gideon to head back, they walked to the door together. The air was cool and crisp, the sky clear and star-filled. They stood on the porch for a moment, the silence of the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the connection they had built, the journey they were on, and the promise of the future. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The look on his face, the way he stood, the way he looked at her, all of it was a testament to his presence, his commitment, his support. He turned and began the walk back, his silhouette a powerful, dark shape against the night. Evelyn watched him, her heart full, her spirit soaring. She was not just surviving, she was living, and she was not alone. She turned and went back inside, the warmth of the cabin welcoming her. She went to bed, her mind still spinning with the thoughts of their conversation, the plans they had made, the shared future that was unfolding before them. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace. She was home, she was loved, she was safe. And she knew in the deepest part of her heart that this was only the beginning. The journey they were on was long, arduous, and challenging, but it was a journey that she was happy to be on, especially with Gideon by her side. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, the dreams that followed soft, gentle, and full of promise. She was no longer the widow of Bitter Creek. She was a woman of the frontier, a survivor who had found her match, a partner who stood veikipte at her in the face of whatever the world might throw their way. She was ready, and she was, for the first time in her life, truly, completely, undeniably at peace. The next morning, she woke with the same sense of purpose, the same lightheartedness, the same joy. She went about her day with a renewed energy, the tasks that had once seemed daunting now easily accomplished. She was stronger, more capable, more resilient, and she knew that she was ready for whatever the day might bring. She spent the morning working in the garden, the seeds she had planted now beginning to show signs of life, a tiny, fragile, yet persistent testament to her hope, to her faith, to her resilience. She looked out over the homestead, the fence she had helped repair standing firm and tall, the garden thriving, the cabin warm and welcoming. She saw the evidence of her work, the tangible proof of her effort, the symbol of her life. She was proud of what she had achieved, proud of the woman she had become, proud of the life she was building. And she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead was long, but she was ready. She was ready for the challenges, the trials, the storms, for she knew that she would face them with Gideon, her rock, her guardian, her partner. She was ready for the future, for the promise, for the hope, for she knew that she would build it veikipte at him, step by step, day by day, moment by moment. She was ready for life, for the beauty, for the struggle, for the journey, for she knew that it would be shared, that it would be meaningful, and that it would be hers and his and theirs together. The town of Bitter Creek could whisper, could judge, could try to intimidate, but they could not shake the foundation that she had built. They could not touch the strength she had found, the resilience she had developed, the bond she had formed. They were irrelevant, their petty grievances and their small-minded judgments, nothing more than the noise of the wind, the dust of the road, the fleeting, insignificant distractions in the face of the truth that she and Gideon had created. She stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the clear, crisp mountain air, and felt the power of the land, the strength of the mountains, the resilience of the life she was living. She was a part of this place, this world, and she was at last where she belonged. And as she looked toward the mountains, the home of the man who had come into her life and changed everything, she knew that she was not just surviving. She was finally, truly, and completely alive. And that was all that mattered. The valley was silent, still and peaceful, a testament to the life that she was living, the strength that she had found, the resilience that she had developed, the bond that she had formed. She was ready for the day, the work, the life, the journey, for she knew that she was at last truly and completely at peace. The world was hers, the life was hers, the future was hers, and she was, with Gideon, together, truly and completely alive. And as the day unfolded, she knew that this was only the beginning of a life that would be filled with purpose, with meaning, with love, and with the shared strength of a partnership that would last a lifetime. The seasons did not duete pass in the Montana Territory. They felt as if they were being etched into the very bones of the land. As the warmth of summer took hold, transforming the valley into a tapestry of lush, vibrant green, the homestead that had once been a symbol of isolation and hardship became something entirely different. It was now a home. The cabin, once drafty and cold, had been sealed and expanded, the wood glowing with the care they had poured into it. The garden, which had been a patch of rocky, neglected soil, was now a thriving cornucopia of life, a testament to what could be accomplished when two people refused to let their circumstances define their potential. But more than the physical changes, it was the shift in the air itself, a sense of permanence, of belonging, that had settled over the property like a soft, comforting blanket. Evelyn was no longer the fragile, haunted widow who had arrived with a trunk full of memories and a heart full of grief. The lines of exhaustion that had once marred her face had been smoothed away by months of steady, honest work and the quiet, restorative peace of being safe. Her eyes, still the same deep, striking sapphire, now held a light that reached far beyond the surface, a light that came from knowing her own worth, from understanding that her softness was not a weakness to be exploited, but a source of strength that had allowed her to survive the hardest winters and the coldest hearts. She had learned through the slow, steady rhythm of the days that she didn't need to be hard to be strong. She had learned that resilience was not about resisting the wind, but about knowing how to bend without breaking, and having the right anchor when the storm hit its peak. Gideon, too, was a man transformed, though the change was subtle, visible only to those who knew him well. He was still the giant, the man of few words, the silent protector whose mere presence could command a room or silence a crowd. But the hardness that had once defined him, the barrier he had built against the world to keep himself and everyone else at a distance, had softened. The lines around his eyes were no longer etched by the solitary strain of a man who carried his own world on his shoulders, but by the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally found his place. He still lived in the high country, still kept to his routines, but his solitude was no longer an exile. It was a choice, and it was a choice that was now shared. He had found in Evelyn a partner who didn't ask him to be anything other than who he was. She didn't try to change the stillness in him, didn't try to fill the silence with idle chatter or unnecessary demands. She respected his quiet, and in return he gave her the fullness of his presence. One evening, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a long golden glow over the valley, they sat on the porch, a ritual that had become the anchor of their days. The air was warm, smelling of wild sage and the sweet, grassy scent of the late summer harvest. The world was quiet, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic chirping of the crickets, a symphony of the frontier that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Gideon turned his gaze to her, the slate gray of his eyes catching the fading light. He reached out, his hand resting over hers on the wooden bench, his grip firm, warm, and utterly reassuring. He didn't need to speak to convey the weight of what he was feeling. In the touch of his hand, in the look he gave her, she saw the acknowledgement of everything they had been through. He saw the woman she had been, the one who had walked into the livery, shaking with the terror of the storm, and he saw the woman she was now, standing tall and proud in the light of the setting sun. He was proud of her. He was proud of the life they had built. He was proud of the way they had stood together, against the judgment of the town, against the harshness of the elements, against the ghosts of their own pasts. Evelyn leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The solid, immovable weight of his frame was a comfort she would never take for granted. She realized then that the peace she felt was not a lack of challenge. It was a victory. They had earned this moment, this stillness, this connection. They had taken the raw materials of their lives, broken and scattered as they were, and they had forged something that was theirs, something that was strong, something that was permanent. She looked out over the homestead, seeing the way the shadows stretched, the way the light danced on the leaves of the trees. She felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude. She had come to the West looking for a life, for a future, for a sense of belonging, and she had found it, not in the way she had expected, but in a way that was deeper, more meaningful, and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. She had found a partner who didn't just stand by her, but who grew with her, who challenged her to be her best self, and who provided the strength that allowed her to flourish. The town of Bitter Creek was still there, of course. It hadn't changed overnight, and it never would. People still talked, they still gossiped, they still looked for faults in others to distract themselves from the cracks in their own lives. But the power they had once held over her was gone. The judgment of the townspeople, which had once felt like a cage, now felt like nothing more than the buzzing of flies. Annoying, perhaps, but ultimately insignificant. They had established their place, they had earned their respect, and they had created a life that stood apart from the noise. They were no longer defined by the town's expectations. They were defined by their own choices, their own values, and the bond they had built. As the night deepened, the sky turning a deep, velvety indigo, and the first stars beginning to shimmer into existence, Evelyn felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was the life she had dreamed of, the one she had fought for, the one she had survived to claim. And as she looked at Gideon, the man who had been the anchor of her resilience, the partner of her healing, she knew that she was ready for whatever the future might hold. They would have their challenges. That was the nature of the frontier, the nature of life itself, but they would face them together. They would have their storms, but they would be the shelter for each other. They would have their winter, but they would carry the warmth of their connection through the coldest nights. They stood up together, the movement synchronized, a testament to the way their lives had become woven into a single, cohesive existence. They walked into the cabin, the interior welcoming and warm, the remnants of the day's work tucked away, the atmosphere one of simple, honest peace. Gideon lit the lantern, the soft glow casting long, gentle shadows against the log walls, a beacon of safety in the vast open landscape outside. This home, this space, this sanctuary, it was theirs, and it was enough. They sat at the table, the meal simple but satisfying, a reflection of the life they had chosen. They talked, not with the urgency of people trying to fill the void, but with the ease of people who truly enjoyed each other's company. They talked about the land, the crops, the future, the simple, beautiful, grounded realities of their shared world. They didn't need to discuss their feelings anymore. Their actions, their daily life, the way they looked at each other were all the evidence they needed. As the hours passed and the night deepened, the sense of rightness in the cabin was palpable. It was a space defined by respect, by care, by the silent, powerful understanding that existed between them. Evelyn looked around at the things they had built, the items they had gathered, the simple beauty of their life together. She had once been a woman who felt she had no place in the world, no anchor, no strength. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her life had value, that her voice mattered, and that she was deserving of the happiness she had found. Gideon, too, seemed to have let go of the last of the tensions that had held him back. He was more present, more engaged, more at ease in his own skin than he had ever been. He had found in the quiet intimacy of their life a way to be strong without having to be distant, a way to be a protector without having to be a wall. He had learned that he didn't need to be alone to be strong, and that there was a deeper kind of resilience that came from vulnerability, from partnership, from the shared burden of life's challenges. When it came time to rest, they did so with a sense of peace that was absolute. The house was quiet, the world outside was silent, the stars were watching over them, the vast, infinite witness to the small, beautiful life they had created. Evelyn crawled into bed, the weight of the blankets a gentle reminder of the safety she had fought so hard to secure. She closed her eyes, the image of Gideon's face, his rugged, calm, steady presence etched into her mind. She drifted off, not into the restless, haunted sleep of the widow, but into the deep, restorative sleep of the partner, the survivor, the woman who was truly, deeply, and unconditionally at peace. And as the days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months, the life they were building continued to deepen. It was a journey of small moments. The way the light hit the kitchen table in the morning. The way they worked together to bring in the harvest, the quiet, shared silence of an evening spent watching the fire. It was a life of purpose, of meaning, of the simple, undeniable beauty of two people who had found their match, their partner, their rock. The frontier, for all its harshness, for all its challenges, for all its potential to break those who weren't ready, had become the backdrop for their love. It was a beautiful, vast, and unforgiving place, but in the heart of that place they had carved out a sanctuary. They had built a home. They had created a life. And in doing so, they had discovered the truth that they had been searching for all along. That no matter how hard the wind blows, no matter how cold the winter gets, no matter how vast and lonely the world may seem, you are never truly alone if you have found someone who stands with you, who believes in you, and who walks the path of the future by your side. They had moved past the trauma, past the loss, past the bitterness of the world that had tried to define them, and they had stepped into the light of their own potential. They were two souls who had been forged in the crucible of the frontier, and what they had become was stronger, more resilient, and more enduring than the mountains themselves. They were ready for whatever the future held, the joy, the sorrow, the growth, the change, because they knew that they were together, and that was the only truth that mattered. The story of their meeting, the story of their struggle, the story of their healing, it was all a testament to the fact that even in the most broken of lives, even in the most desperate of circumstances, there is the potential for something beautiful to bloom. They had been the seeds that had been scattered by the wind, and they had found the soil, the water, and the strength to grow, to rise, and to become something that was uniquely, profoundly, and undeniably theirs. As I stand here, looking back on the journey we've taken with Evelyn and Gideon, I'm reminded of why Moat do what Moat do here at Cowboy Ironheart. It's not just about the stories or the setting or the romance. It's about the truth that lies at the heart of it all. We are all in our own way, seeking that sanctuary. We are all looking for that strength, that connection, that partner who will stand vekepte haras when the world gets too loud, too cold, or too demanding. And if this story has given you a moment of hope, a moment of reflection, a moment of peace, then my work here is done. But our own journey, you and Moat, is far from over. There are many more stories to tell, many more trails to ride, and many more truths to uncover in the quiet corners of the frontier. Moat want to thank you for being a part of this journey, for your attention, for your support, and for the way you've allowed these characters into your lives. It means more than Moat can say. This journey of the spirit, this exploration of what it means to be resilient, to be strong, to be vulnerable, and to be loved, it is a journey we are all on. And Moat hope that, like Evelyn and Gideon, you are finding your own sanctuary, your own strength, and your own partner, whether in another person, in your own heart, or in the life you are building for yourself. We have come to the end of this particular chapter, but remember, every ending is just a new beginning. The life that Evelyn and Gideon have built is just starting, and so is the life you are building for yourself. Take the lessons you've learned from them, take the hope they've provided, and carry it with you into your own day, your own challenges, and your own journey. Motlughlunk be here, waiting when you re-ready for the next story, the next trail, the next moment of reflection. Until then, hold on to the peace you've found, cherish the strength you've discovered, and keep walking your path with your head held high and your heart open. We have so much more to see, so much more to learn, and so much more to experience together. Thank you, my friends, for everything. Your time, your attention, your presence. It is Vekep Patate makes this channel what it is. And Modem so glad that we have been able to share this space, this time, and this story together. Stay strong, keep your fires burning, and know that you are never alone on the trail. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and Moat will be here, waiting to share the next piece of our collective journey. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the aid of AI tools and has been carefully edited by the team at Cowboy Ironheart. All rights reserved.